right, welcome everyone. My name is Alia and I manage the membership program at the Polygon Gallery. And we have a nice large group tuning in tonight. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us virtually for this members talk. And I want to express my really heartfelt gratitude to all the members and supporters. You're such passionate supporters and champions for the arts. So thank you so much. One housekeeping item, we'll do a Q&A session at the end of the talk. So you can feel free to type your questions into the chat box and we'll try and get to those at the end. And now I'll turn it over to Reid Shire, Director of the Polygon Gallery.
Thank you, Alia, and greetings and welcome everybody. I'm Reid Shire, I'm the Director of the Polygon, and I'll keep my remarks brief. The Polygon Gallery is situated on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, and I want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to conduct our work on their lands and for the opportunity to welcome you all here tonight and to gather in this virtual space. Interior Infinite is part of the Polygon Gallery's exhibition series New Perspectives, revealing diverse perspectives, untold stories, and new voices in visual art. We are very grateful to TD Bank Group as the presenting sponsor of this series, as well as for the generous support in helping us realize the exhibition from Brigitte and Henning Freiby, Paula Palega and David Demers, Leonardo Lara and Michael Prout, and Terrence and Lisa Turner. I'm deeply grateful. Before I introduce Justin, who will lead tonight's tour, I just want to acknowledge the efforts of Alia, who just welcomed us all here tonight. And as members of the gallery, you will have had, I think, the distinct pleasure of Alia's communications and her conversation over the past number of years. And Alia is unfortunately moving on to a university very shortly and will be leaving us next week. And I just want to say how much we will miss her and to thank her for doing such an amazing job for the gallery. I'm really grateful, Alia.
Thanks so much, Reid.
Interior Infinite is a deeply rewarding exhibition, one that if you had not had the chance to see in person, I would like to personally invite all of you to come down to the gallery. And if you have seen it, and I suspect many of you joining us here tonight already have, I'm hopeful tonight's talk will inspire a return visit and that you might invite a friend or two to join you. It was organized by the Polygon's curator, Justin Ramsey, who it's my very distinct pleasure to pass the podium to right now. Justin, please take it away.
Thank you, Reid. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Justin Ramsey, and I'm one of the curators at the Polygon Gallery. For any non-visual listeners joining us, I have light brown skin, hazel eyes, and curly dark brown hair that comes down just past my shoulders. I'm wearing a white crew neck top, and I'm sitting in my living room, which has light gray walls. Over my left shoulder is an arched doorway, and over my right shoulder is a tall fiddle leaf fig and an oil and pastel painting of an ornate vase. I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where I live and work. To the Indigenous peoples on whose land I reside, I offer my deep thanks and allyship. To my fellow Canadians who are settlers like me on these lands, either by their own migration or by that of their forebears, I urge all of us to find the ways in which we can each, in our own lives and capacities, advance the urgent work of reconciliation and restitution. Michael, next slide, please. I begin this evening with a quote from a writer, Ursula K. Le Guin. What your eyes have seen, they have seen. Once you see the injustice, you can never again in good faith deny the oppression and defend the oppressor. What was loyalty is now betrayal. From now on, if you don't resist, you collude. It's a quote that resonates with me at this time as we face stark reminders of the genocide on which Canada is founded, a genocide that marks not a shameful chapter of this country's history, but the near entirety of its history, predating Confederacy and persisting long thereafter. To my fellow Canadians, please, if you haven't, visit trc.ca to learn more about the findings and calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We can and must demand better of ourselves and of our elected officials. And a big part of that is as simple as being informed. But this quote has resonated with me this past year in some ways precisely because I'm Canadian. I'm a mixed race Canadian of Black heritage. And when we hear over and over again about a Black person being killed in the United States, sometimes by civilians, often by police, there's a refrain in my head that goes something like, thank goodness we don't live in America, which is ironic, living as I do in a country built on racial violence. So I wanted to re-examine this impulse. Michael, next slide, please. I also felt I had to re-examine this impulse, this refrain, so glad we don't live in the States, because it alerted me to the fact that I had used this refrain as a way to normalize anti-Black violence to myself. Similar offenses take place here in Canada, but I had often let the goings-on south of the border overshadow them. I realized that I'd been taking a blinkered and lazy position. And this was made luridly clear to me when George Floyd was murdered in broad daylight by a white police officer last year. It was an act of violence that was, in some ways, disturbingly ordinary, but also singular because of its visibility. So often these murders are a shot or a hail of bullets not captured on camera. Mr. Floyd's death, watched by millions, made me aware of how easily I had heard reports of similar incidents that I didn't witness, only to turn away and think to myself, thank God we don't live in the States. And that in turn made me contemplate my complicity in this violence, my complacence with this disturbing normality. I remembered how, shortly after the murder, conservative media outlets attempted to defend the officer's actions, saying that Mr. Floyd seemed drugged or addled. Watching the body cam footage, Mr. Floyd seems scared. And we know in hindsight that he had every reason to be, almost as though he foresaw what was coming. And I wondered, in what world can a person reasonably expect to be killed like this? How has this been normalized? Next slide, please. While this was happening, we were in the throes of a global pandemic. Side note, we still are. So stay safe, don't get sloppy, and take care of yourselves and each other. But unlike now, the Polygon Gallery was closed to the public at that time. At the time of Mr. Floyd's murder, we were online, pivoting to a fully digital program, taking to social media and podcasts to insist on the importance of the arts. And I found myself in a moment of crisis, trying to reconcile this insistence on art's cruciality with the atrocity that had just taken place. I was asking myself, what does art have to say about this? I'll admit I was feeling quite hopeless and questioning what role, if any, art could play. Next slide, please. And then I remembered the sound suits. They're extraordinary full-body wearable sculptures by Black American visual artist and performer Nick Cave. And they're called sound suits because of the incredible noise that they make when moved around in. The first was made in 1992, entirely out of twigs. It was designed as camouflage and armor to protect the Black body from racial violence. And indeed, Cave made it in direct response to the brutal beating of Black civilian Rodney King by the LAPD in 1991. So this was a body of work that was addressing this issue directly. Next slide, please. Nick Cave is still making sound suits and performing in them, and over time, the sound suits have evolved from being made of detritus, meant to blend in with their surroundings, to standing out unabashedly. They're glittering, flamboyant, celebratory, and queer. They still protect the wearer from prejudicial judgments around race, age, sex, and gender, but they're not interested in hiding anymore. Through their hypervisibility, they assert presence. They enact resistance. They defy erasure. Next slide, please. I wanted to conceptualize an exhibition based on this ethic that the sound suit represented, but what was this ethic exactly? It lay somewhere in the tension between disclosure and disguise, how the right garment, the right mask can somehow conceal one's identity while also revealing more about it. Hunkpapa Lakota artist Dana Claxton was one of the first artists that came to mind, specifically her headdress series, in which Dana and 4 other women completely obscure their features with beadwork layered over the contours of their bodies. Even though their faces can't be seen, they're inscribing intergenerational histories and charting geopolitical territories upon their bodies, visualizing their status as keepers of knowledge and carriers of culture. The exhibition features Dana's self-portrait from the series, along with a brand new work, one in which Dana dons her handbag collection made by Indigenous Mexican artisans. It's a fun peek into the artist's own personal proclivities, as well as a more serious introspection. The artist interrogates what it means to possess cultural belongings and what responsibility is owed to these symbols, while at the same time treating this leather as a second skin, expanding her own body through these artifacts. Next slide, please. The idea of disguise as disclosure immediately brought to my mind drag performance, obviously, and how wigs and makeup, rather than hiding away a person, actually brings them more fully forward. And in many cases, those of us who are alienated by normative ideals around race or gender or ability will try to pass as acceptable. This pressure towards conformity is its own form of disguise. And sometimes donning a mask or a wig or the right pair of heels can take the pressure off. It's liberating. Needless to say, I wanted to feature an artist working in drag, but one criticism that I have of drag personally is its tendency to reinforce rather than challenge gender binaries. Gender is a social construct, a way of policing possibilities by assigning behavioral norms, traits, and roles to people based on their chromosomal sex. Gender is, to put it mildly, absurd. There's a stronger word I would use, but I won't. For one thing, these norms have been constructed largely by men to favor men, placing them in positions of authority while excusing violent and oppressive behaviors as being masculine rather than as simply unacceptable and socially destructive, like call a spade a spade. For one thing, if we were to make a long list of all the traits deemed masculine and all the traits deemed feminine, we would find that each of us possesses a big mix of these traits from both lists at different times, regardless of our sex. And to that point, chromosomal sex is itself a spectrum with many permutations beyond just XX or XY. Next slide, please. So I was reluctant to feature a drag artist who claims to be performing the opposite sex simply by portraying heavy-handed gender stereotypes. But Sin Wai Kin, a Canadian artist based in the UK, was doing something different. Sin identifies as gender non-binary, embracing neither masculinity nor femininity, but they are biologically female. For Sin, being raised and socialized as a girl according to feminine norms felt unnatural and incongruous with her non-binary identity. Femininity was and is a performance, and Sin calls it out as such. Normally, we associate drag queens with being male, but by wearing their femininity as drag, Sin brings attention to the facade-like artificiality of gender as a social construct that's imposed on the body. And I love their powerful commentary. Still, drag isn't usually a burden. Anyone who's worn a costume, especially a handmade costume, can perhaps relate to how it grants permission to be freer and bolder and more confident, not because pretending to be someone else, but because suddenly you're confronted with the incredible elasticity of your own self. For me, this raises the question, when we talk about identity, what is it we're referring to? In discussing my exhibition, I've stayed consciously and resolutely clear of the term identity politics, because that to me signals a zeitgeist in which we were expected to state in unambiguous terms exactly who and what we are. I find this essentializing and problematic. Next slide, please. Take, for example, the work of British-Nigerian artist Yinka Shonibare. He often works with a particular fabric that visually signals West Africa. It's ubiquitous there, and yet it was imported from Europe, where it was brought in by the Dutch, who copied it from wax-dyed Javanese textiles in Southeast Asia. There's an understanding here that identities are hybrid and complex and resist straightforward categorization. This piece, Un ballo in maschera, takes the same title as the 1859 opera by Giuseppe Verdi and shares its subject matter as well, the assassination of King Gustav III of Sweden at a masquerade ball, a real historical event. There's an element of drag in Shonabari's work, with Gustav being played by a woman, but notably in this version, Gustav keeps popping back up from the dead after being assassinated. The assassination has to repeat 3 times before it sticks, after which the whole video then replays backwards to the beginning, returning to start. For me, I read this as a commentary on the politics of violence that persist despite their absurdity and dysfunction. Again, I return to that question of the things that we accept as quote unquote normal. Next slide, please. And the recognition that normality is something arbitrary, something that can be defined and redefined as long as we have the social imagination to do so, is important here. Realizing that society is changeable perhaps follows from the realization that the self is ever changing. Who we are is constantly shifting depending on where we are, who we're with, who we're performing for, what we know. Identity is plural within each of us and is almost always a performance. It's a layered and imbricated terrain that's shifting, with new aspects surfacing as others are swept beneath. And it's exciting because of the limitless possibilities that that implies for each of us. I use the series Somnyama Ngonyama, Hail the Dark Lioness by South African visual activist Zanele Muholi as a way of depicting this. It's sort of a visual anchor for the exhibition. In this ongoing series of self-portraits, Muholi photographs themselves at different locations all around the world, using found objects and on-hand materials to respond directly to the specific histories of Black diaspora and labor in that particular locale. Muholi is constantly investigating their ancestors and how these migrations have shaped their being as a queer Black South African woman in the 21st century. 4 portraits from Somnyama Ngonyama punctuate the exhibition at different intervals, showing a body in constant flux to point toward and embrace the instability of identity. Next slide, please. At the same time, in this age of social media, we're constantly buffeted by this reductive rhetoric around so-called authenticity, around being your best self or living your best life. To buy into such a neoliberal myth as a best self is to deny oneself the capacity for expansion. We are all unresolved, works in progress from the day we are born until the day we die. I wanted to feature artists who embrace the spirit of discovery. Meryl McMaster does so beautifully. She's of mixed Plains Cree descent, and her self-portraits are informed by the stories shared with her by her father and his community. Crafting each outfit in her studio, McMaster then performs on the lands where these histories and legends have taken place. She animates them, interpreting and reimagining them, remixing traditional and contemporary influences to create something dreamlike and outside of time, something possibly futuristic. Next slide, please. The exhibition heavily features self-portraiture, but for me, these are diametrically different from the selfies we see so often today. Selfies are taken because the photographer has a preconceived goal to be liked. They're meant to be likable, calibrated to the taste of followers. They're not meant to unsettle or disturb, but to be thoughtlessly consumed. They are normativity epitomized. The works in Interior Infinite are not eager to please. I think they're pleasing because they confront and challenge and unsettle. Nowhere is this clearer to me than in the self-portraits of Latinx artist Martín Gutierrez. Gutierrez created a large 124-page glossy magazine Actually, I have a copy. I'm going to grab it. This is the magazine. It's a big 124-page glossy magazine in which she conceptualized, composed, styled, lit, and shot every single editorial spread, every advertisement herself, in order to express the breadth and complexity of her identities. And never once does the project feel self-indulgent. There are images that I read as raw and vulnerable, like this one you see on the screen, entitled Queer Age Swimming Lessons, which I read as a visual performance of gender dysphoria, the impression of monstrosity, literally feeling out of the water, of feeling like a stranger to one's own body. Next slide, please. Other images, like her Demon series, are powerfully confrontational, pushing glamour and cosmetics to such an extreme that they veer from beauty into terror. The magazine is titled Indigenous Woman, which is something of a wordplay. It suggests the artist's Mayan heritage, while also taking the word indigenous to mean something inherent or innate. Womanhood is something innately understood to Gutierrez, an inherent self-knowledge in spite of her being assigned male at birth. Next slide, please. If there is any trace of social media tropes in the exhibition, it's manifest in the new performance by Tsimshin Gitsun artist Skineris, which plays out over TikTok. On social media, many Indigenous commentators and users have adopted as a native icon Baby Yoda from the Disney Plus series The Mandalorian. CBC's done a couple of really good articles about this phenomenon that I recommend you checking out. In the show, Baby Yoda is uprooted from his own cultural context, cut off from his language. He's both revered and reviled for his latent wisdom and spiritual power. And as Indigenous communities have quickly embraced this non-Indigenous cultural icon and seen an affiliation with him, Reid considers what this widespread adoption says about the status of actual Indigenous representation in the media, for women in particular. She observes certain archetypes that often mischaracterize Indigenous women. And so by creating a character that satirizes these archetypes, she seeks to undermine them. Contrasted with the ornate and enameled detail of Gutierrez's alter egos, we see how Reid's regalia is made from tongs, paper clips, and canning lids, cobbled together from around the house objects. That in itself is a nod to native princess tropes on social media, in which girls display full regalia while also quietly questioning the classism inherent in this, as Reid weighs the implications for those who don't have heirlooms or have been cut off from heritage in that way. But Reid is unfailingly a comedian. The TikTok videos are very funny. They push buttons, raise questions without offering easy answers, and tread lightly. Reid is cognizant of the need for laughter at this time of so much pain and is cautious about inflicting more. I recommend that you check them out. You can visit TikTok online through your browser if you haven't downloaded the app, and in the search bar, look up Victim Princess Mother, all one word. Next slide, please. There's another digital figure in the exhibition, this one portrayed by trans model Valentine Dehin in a video piece by Austrian filmmaker Ursula Meyer. As many of us adopt online personas and digital avatars as extensions of our identities, I wanted to include such a figure in Interior Infinite. Meyer was inspired by the looping animations that video game characters default to when left to idle without any control inputs put in from the player. But Meyer uses this as a jumping off point to examine what it means to be a cyborg in this day and age. It all sounds very science fiction, but if we define a cyborg as a being that's part organic, part technological, then we realize quickly that we are all cyborgs to certain extents. You know, the clothes we wear to the devices we use are technologies, and that our lives and ways of living are dependent on so many materials and systems, both living and non-living, that extend beyond the human being. So what if we were to consider the things that we consume, the waste that we produce, the spaces we occupy as extensions of ourselves, enfolding these into our identities? how would that change what we owe to them? How would it affect the ways in which we affect the earth and our fellow species upon it? It's a crucial question now in the Anthropocene, one that's quietly embedded in Meyer's stunning piece, which looms out of the darkness and catches the viewer unawares. Confrontation is a key point. Digital programming during the pandemic brought with it a special challenge that it was nigh impossible to replicate in digital JPEGs the experience of standing before a work of art. Art has a presence, and I wanted to lean into that with this exhibition. With only a couple of exceptions, the works in Interior Infinite feature a single figure drawing the viewer into an intimate encounter. In addition, these figures don't exist in their own atomized microcosms, but instead all inhabit the space together. They are a gathering. Next slide, please. In the exhibition, I deliberately embedded these portraits shot by Ethiopian-born artist Aida Molone between the works by Meryl McMaster, because there's a common visual language being spoken by both as they remix traditional motifs with avant-garde touches in order to visualize possible alternatives. For Molone, who returned to Addis Ababa and has lived there for many years, these works offer an alternative to the undifferentiated imagery out of the African continent that we are often exposed to in Western media. Here in these works, there's no trace of war or poverty or famine. Molone offers alternate imagery that's insightful and informed and nuanced and empowering. Next slide, please. Michael, next, oh, thank you. And I would be remiss not to mention that Molone is actually the artist commissioned for the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize exhibition, which, like everything else in 2020, pivoted to a digital platform last year. And it happened quite late, I think last winter, and you can still view the gallery online, and this is a work from that. So you can go through the whole digital exhibition, and it's stunning. So please check that out. Next slide, please. So thinking about these works as a gathering, as I brought together some of these artists as a proposed exhibition, which had at its thematic core the revelatory potential for disguise and masquerade, my colleague and mentor, our chief curator, Helga Pakasar, likened it to the carnivalesque, which was spot on. The tradition of carnival, or carnival, as it's sometimes pronounced, is all about using disguise to question normalcy, to push boundaries, and by doing so, expand our social imagination. Celebrated with the Christian holiday of Lent, Carnival takes place in March and is believed to have syncretized various folk festivals and feast days associated with the renewal of spring. Whether it's the masquerade of Venetian Carnival or the extravagant parade of Trinidadian Carnival, consistent among its global manifestations is a reimagining of society. Old hierarchies are thrown out, new social orders are formed. Masks, makeup, and raiment are the means by which this is achieved because they enable a sense of unfettered expression that is uniquely individual and yet amplified by collectivity. The universality of this drive speaks to me of the need for a release valve, the need to, if only once in a while, escape the confines of conformity, of normativity, and imagine what else could be. Next slide, please. The photographs shown here are by Zach Ove, who is of Trinidadian descent and is the son of trailblazing Black filmmaker Horace Ove. Zach is renowned for his sculptures based on the familiar characters from Trinidadian Carnival. But before he made his name that way, he visited Port of Spain in Trinidad every year for 6 years, from 2000 to 2006, to document the carnival processions at their peak. The photographs haven't been shown very often, so it's a real pleasure to present 4 of them in Interior Infinite to help ground and visually define my reference to Carnival and what it means. Because it was in Carnival that I found that strong but somewhat ineffable ethic of the sound suit. Carnival influenced which works were brought together for Interior Infinite and how they sort of fell in with each other. Carnival has an impulse to expand our social imagination, to assert presence through methods of disguise, to challenge and overhaul normalcy, and that which is simply accepted as given. I return to that question that plagued me in the aftermath of George Floyd's death. In what world can someone reasonably expect to be killed like this? How has this been normalized? And as people pine for return to normal, I can't help but shudder. I don't want to go back to normal if that's what normality was. I want to go forward to something better. Next slide, please. There's a festival in Jamaica called John Canoe, and like Trinidadian Carnival, it's a celebration of emancipation renowned for its elaborate masquerade processions and has its own cast of archetypal characters. One of these is a trickster figure called Actor Boy. Jamaican-born, Victoria-based artist Charles Campbell wears the mask shown in Interior Infinite when he steps into the character of Actor Boy, as you see him doing here. In Campbell's performance series, Actor Boy inhabits a parallel timeline, one in which emancipation led naturally to racial equality. And using the vibrations of birdsong, Actor Boy crosses over from his alternate universe, crossing the dimensions, and enters our timeline in order to investigate what went wrong with our version of events. We're living, as it were, in the less likely scenario. Next slide, please. In the gallery where the mask is displayed, birdsong can be heard in the room. While it might seem like random wild calls, it's in fact been chopped into Morse code. If you were to decipher it, the birdsong spells out a passage from Octavia E. Butler's novel, The Parable of the Sower, which reads, "Yet every child is cast from paradise into growth and new community, into vast ongoing change." This is one of many textual sources referenced in the exhibition. While straightforward didactics are available through the website's audio guide and bookstore, I think there's something to be said about loose associations, about sitting in curiosity and wonder. I hope that the citations found throughout the gallery can steer visitors toward other thinkers, writers, poets, and activists, artists in their own right, whose ideas echo with the works on view. Next slide, please. And these words, together with the works, foreground a plethora of lived realities and experiences that are vivid and valid and real, but outside the expectations of normativity. For many of these artists and writers, the experience of the white, straight, cisgendered male protagonist that dominates our cultural narratives is not normal in any intrinsic or relatable way. Yet that white supremacist, hetero male chauvinistic perspective is often treated as somehow default, as though other experiences diverge from this mythical central nexus. And this is a ridiculous assumption, but one that's governed representation in the arts and in culture broadly for a very, very long time. I see self-portraiture as a powerful gesture. The artists are not only taking hold of the camera, a privilege historically reserved for the white, the wealthy, and often the male, but turning that camera back on themselves while wearing splendid guises of their own construction. That, to me, is a powerful intervention into our visual history and lexicon. Next slide, please. Canadian-born, UK-based artist Zadie Zha performs in her film Child of Magohalmi and the Echoes of Creation. And in this film, Zha celebrates the richness and value of matriarchal traditions and matrilineal knowledge systems, while also contemplating their erasure and loss. As someone born and raised on the west coast of Canada, yet with an abstract impression of a Korean motherland, Zha represents this duality by folding together two maternal figures, Grandmother Mago, or Magohalmi, a creator goddess of ancient shamanic Korean tradition. And on the other hand, J2, or Granny, J2 was the scientific name of the matriarch of the J-pod of southern resident orcas off the coast of BC. Matriarchal traditions on the Korean peninsula were marginalized and forgotten as the rise of Confucianism diminished women's social standing and role in civic life. J2, who was believed to have lived for about a century, passed away in 2016 after protecting the J-pod and passing down knowledge for decades. Now the J-pod faces the imminent threat of extinction due to human activity. In the film, Zha herself occupies the role of shaman. Shamans inhabit two worlds at once, the spiritual and physical realms, the land of the living and of the dead. Present-day BC and ancient Korea form the two worlds inhabited by this singular being that we see Zha herself performing as. Next slide, please. And as it became clear to me early on that self-portraiture would factor into this exhibition in a major way, I immediately thought of Carrie Mae Weems, an artist whom I've long admired. Weems is one of, I think, the most exciting and important artists working in American photography today. Her kitchen table series were self-portraits that staged domestic scenes of Black American life to counteract the common misrepresentations of Black family life in mainstream media. Her series of found ethnographic photographs of enslaved African people, From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried, was profoundly moving for me as a person of slave descent. So I was thrilled to discover a series of self-portraits, a triptych by Weems, done as part of her Louisiana project in 2003 that fit with Interior Infinite beautifully. Next slide, please. I was speaking with Naya Lewis, a curator here in Vancouver who's brilliant, and she's of Trinidadian descent, to learn more about the history of Carnival. She described to me how these Lenten holidays were some of the only occasions that enslaved people were given reprieve from work, while their owners used the tradition of masquerade that was part of Carnival to lampoon their slaves. Carnival also provided a rare opportunity for enslaved people to satirize the whites back. Weems examines how this was carried through the Mardi Gras festivities of New Orleans, such as the elite Rex Ball, which was historically exclusive to whites, by dressing in tuxedos and covering her face in animal masks that at once allude to the African continent, as well as very overtly to US politics. Weems inscribes these histories expertly on her body. We can't see an ounce of her skin or hair, and yet the amount of visual storytelling she achieves just through disguise is staggering. And it reminds me again of the sound suit, designed to cover the wearer's entire body, yet still assert the wearer's undeniable presence and integrity. And I'm reminded of an essay by Black American teacher and activist Bell Hooks on feminist pedagogies. Hooks reminds us that knowledge is necessarily embodied. We carry with us what we know. For so long, we've been fed the myth that the mind and body are somehow separate, that the mind occupies a higher, loftier realm independent of the body's physical limitations. But this just isn't true. In order to learn and teach effectively, we have to take into account our entire being and make sure that it's well cared for. You know, our brains are wet tissue, our thoughts and feelings influence one another seamlessly. And I think about the physical carrying of knowledge and the ways in which we embody what we know and our experience when I look at many of the works in this exhibition. Next slide, please. One in particular that strikes me is the new installation by Mohawk artist Lacey Burning, Seeing in the Dark. Two projectors showing color negative footage of a walk through the woods are projected onto a figure curled in the fetal position. The figure is covered with a mosaic of shattered mirror shards. It represents the artist as a child in effigy. They examine their position as a queer Indigenous person, contemplating the land and their desire to be part of it, to disappear into it, camouflaged, even as it teeters amid ecological collapse. Through this work, the interior workings of the mind, and therefore the body, spill out and tessellate, creating an image that's both fractured and iridescent and draws us into that subjectivity in a way that's really powerful. Next slide, please. And in reading about carnival from the perspective of modern writers and theorists, this theme of embodiment recurs. The carnivalesque becomes entwined with the grotesque. Grotesque here doesn't mean disgusting, but low. Etymologically, grotesque is related to the word grotto. It has an earthly, physical connotation that pertains to the body, to the flesh, to the carnal. And in a few of these texts, where the carnivalesque and the grotesque enmesh with one another, I encountered the figure of Baubo. Now, Baubo is a sort of obscure Greek goddess. She's a witch and a crone who's sexually promiscuous. She embodies not only carnality, but also a flagrant rejection of norms and expectations. In archaeology, Baubo figurines are recognizable for their enlarged and exaggerated vulvas. Estonian artist Chris Lemsalu updates Baubo's iconography for the present day, making it edgy and androgynous. She also composed a new piece for this sculpture, which is the fabric fire. The previous iteration, it was an LED component, but now it's made of textiles, particularly for this show. And that in itself is a reference to the pagan traditions of Lemsalu's own homeland, such as jumping over the fire at midsummer. Next slide, please. This is Lemsalu here recently at the Venice Biennale, where she did this amazing procession, and she's achieved widespread recognition for her processional performances and intricate costumes. And though it wasn't possible to organize a live performance with this artist during the pandemic, I was quite thrilled to find this sculpture that directly referenced this strange goddess who kept appearing in my readings and research. Its inclusion in the exhibition feels like a necessary homage and a way to bring awareness to the exciting work that Lemsalu is doing. Next slide, please. There's an episode in Baubo's myth in Greek mythology in which Persephone is kidnapped by Hades and spirited away to the underworld. Demeter is Persephone's mother and also the goddess of the earth, so her despair brings with it catastrophic famine. Baubo is the only one capable of making Demeter laugh again. It was interesting to me how this often maligned figure played this brief but world-saving role. It reminds me of carnival, of the necessary release, the need for exuberance and mirth that comes around once a year. I wonder if the ancients who told this legend tacitly recognized the necessity of the carnivalesque, a necessity that rings true now as we decide how to move forward in a changing world. Next slide, please. In the end, it comes back to the interior infinite. What I believe is a limitless capacity within each of us, constrained only by an illusion of normativity that restricts the scope of what we imagine ourselves and our world to be. A friend of mine recently recounted to me his experience of bringing his 2 young sons to see the exhibition. The younger, who's about 3, I think, was drawn to the Martin Gutierrez works, The Demons, but he said that it scared him. He said, "These are scary, I'm scared." And the elder boy, who's around 5, hugged his little brother and said, "You know, it can be scary, but it can also be lovely and it's okay. I think you're scared because it just looks different, but it's quite lovely." And the younger boy thought about this and said, "Okay." And later they both asked their dad if they could dress up because they always have to, quote, dress up like boys. So now their dad is figuring out what they want to be, and they're going to dress up as whatever they want. And this anecdote makes me so happy, as you can probably tell, because when I heard this, I thought that the show is doing the work that I hoped it would, that it, for somebody, it had the desired effect. My friends' kids can be boys, and so much else besides, or define for themselves what being a boy means. Factors like gender, racialization, social media, and the commoditization of identity, all of these severely limit what we can imagine being. I sincerely hope that the sense of expansiveness and embracing, as they say, the loveliness of something unfamiliar is a sentiment that these children can carry with them as they grow up, as they shape the world in their own vibrant image. Next slide, please. I think back to my crisis of purpose in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, the anxiety that art had nothing to say or do in the face of such pervasive atrocity. And then I hear about my friend's sons in Interior Infinite and that experience. And I find it reassuring that art does, in fact, have some role to play. And that's where I'll end things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. Yes, thank you so much for such a thoughtful and thought-provoking talk. It's so wonderful to hear from you. And we have so many audience members here, so I would love to hear from them. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type those in the chat. Okay, we have one. We have a question here from Reid, our colleague. He says, thank you, Justin. There's humor that runs through many of the works you've chosen. I wonder if you could talk about how this might have been a part of your vision from the beginning, or a discovery along the way, or perhaps both.
That's an interesting question. There is humor. I think that this was a discovery along the way to understand, as artists work with these themes, and they put themselves into in front of the camera. There's an element of performance that is often consciously satirical, that plays with parody, that plays with exaggeration, and that in itself, I think, also comes back to that notion of carnival and the carnivalesque. But I have to say, it was something that emerged and wasn't necessarily part of my intention from the beginning. I was introduced over the course of working on this show to so many interesting artists. And, you know, rather than showing one work from a whole bunch of different artists, it was important for me to choose artists and show multiple works by them so that we're seeing this multifaceted expression of identity. And so there are these other works, there's this whole other group of works that I think are play with effervescence more visually and more consciously. And for me, if I'm honest, the show started in such a place of pain and gravity that I kind of leaned into the defiance aspect of carnival more so than I consciously leaned into the joyful aspect of it. And it heartens me to hear that joy is still sort of palpable in it and discoverable in it. But there are other works that are maybe more overtly visually joyful or playful that for me, I didn't bring into this show because I myself was still dealing with a kind of heaviness. So it's nice to hear that humor comes through. I credit the artists for that. And I'm glad that there's so many readings to the work in this show. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Justin. I have a question. It's something you touched on briefly in your talk or a few times, and something that I really felt when I was walking through the exhibition. You called the works and the exhibition kind of a gathering, which I really liked how you put that, because you really feel these wonderful moments of dialogue between the work in the exhibition. And I'm wondering if you can maybe share maybe one of your favorite moments of conversation between works, whether that is something, whether it's an example of one that you planned or one that maybe revealed itself to you in the process of actually mounting the show and putting the works together in person.
Oh, that's a fun question. There are a few, but I'll try to be selective. There are two works that have a weird sort of conversation with each other, and they're actually on diametrically opposite ends of the gallery. One is Zadie Zha's Child of Magohalni, and the other is Nick Cave's video Blot, which I included so that visitors could see a sound suit in motion. And hear why it's called a sound suit. And I've had so many people comment that the sound of the sound suit sounds like the ocean. And so as you travel from that at one end to the other, there's this strange coming back to the water that for me maybe signals the sort of internationality of this gathering of artists in a curious way that was unintentional. I also love Blot in conversation with that figure that sort of moves against that glistening white background in close proximity to Ursula Meyer's Avatar that floats on that jet black background. They're both so ethereal and they're both hypnotic. I've heard people kind of get overwhelmed in that big central room with all of those images and then kind of go into that corner and be hypnotized and calmed back down. And I love that affect. The last one I'll say is that I really love the last room of the show. Lacey Burning's video piece of walking through the woods and the sound of Charles Campbell's birds. They're this uncanny mixture that's, to my mind, so perfect. And I walk into that room that just has, 4 pieces in it: the sound piece, Lacey Burning, Charles Campbell, and the last Zanele Muholi, the only gelatin silver print. And it has a different feeling than the rest of the show. And I think it's a beautiful place to land at the end. So I was really happy with that too. But yeah, those are some of the relationships that really, in conceiving of that central room and bringing that together, that was kind of in my mind. I envisioned that for a long time as kind of like the core gathering. And so when it came together, even though it delighted me, it didn't really surprise me. In many ways, that was the most realized part of the whole show. It was these odd other little corners that took me by surprise.
I love it. Thank you. So a question from Carol. Do you think joy can be a form of resistance?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's actually, I don't know if you've read it. I have it here. I actually got this big stack of a bunch of the books in Interior Infinite. I mentioned there are citations on the walls because these writers are also, I see them as peers and colleagues of these artists, and in many cases artists in their own right, who use words. One of them is Billy Ray Belcourt. And I don't know if you've had a chance to read his book. I highly recommend it, A History of My Brief Body. All of these books I got at local bookstores. Don't use Amazon, it's bad for the environment, even though they probably are running the server that Zoom is based on. So we're technically, supporting them right now. But there's actually a quote by Billy Ray Belcourt. And I'm trying to think, I might have recorded it somewhere, but it's about joy. Yes, this is the quote. Wherever there's an injunction on something as integral to livability of wherever there's an injunction on something as integral to the livability of the world as joy, there is underground activity, a fugitive cooperation of feeling, a commune of love that isn't to be perceived by the dominant eye. With joy, we breach the haze of suffering that denies us creativity and literature. Joy is an art, is an ethics of resistance. So absolutely, I think it can be. And I almost put that that quote in the show, I actually ended up going with a different quote by Billy Ray Belcourt about futurity and beauty, because again, kind of like I said in response to Reid's question, joy felt a little bit far from me as I was doing this exhibition, but it's the other part of Carnival. I think that Carnival is is um, is is it's resistance, it's defiance, and it's joy, and it's these two things, one begets the other. And I sometimes imagine, there's this body of other work that could form maybe a more a version of Interior Infinite that kind of leans more into the joyful aspect. But it's definitely, I think that in many cases, this sort of pressure to conform, the pressures of normativity are are restrictions on joy for all of us. And I think that the more we push back, that's an expression of exactly that. I think about the people who kind of so-called benefit the most from our sort of normative, heteronormative conventions. And you think of the sort of the misogyny inherent in male on male violence, of this fear of being perceived of being to be girlish. I don't know where that comes from. We all have women in our lives, for the most part, most of us, who we love and respect and admire, and yet we have this plague, this scourge of not wanting to be perceived as feminine. Well, first of all, femininity and masculinity are both completely changeable and in some ways meaningless terms. But when you think about normativity as a set of things that we are expected to do, even those who stand to gain the most from it, so to speak, are still oppressed by it, are still unable to express or show a full range of human emotions. And so I really think every time that we push back against this, it's from a place of joy, or not necessarily, even if it's not a felt joy, it's a striving for joy. It's a push toward joy that drives us to do this, a yearning for it. And so again, like, I think as it's been pointed out, like, hopefully this comes through in Interior Infinite, regardless of whether or not I was necessarily feeling it consciously when the show came together. As visual resistance, as something that's carnivalesque. I hope that that's inevitable. That was kind of a tangent, but we got there.
Thanks, Justin. I have a question from Karen, and I can answer half of it, and then half of it Justin can answer. Karen is asking if there are going to be tours of the exhibition. And yes, Karen, you can pre-book your spot online, and there are tours weekly, 6:30 p.m. on Thursdays and 1:30 p.m. on Saturdays, and I can email you the link. And then another question from Karen is, are there any special events related to the exhibition? So I'm wondering, Justin, if you can talk about any additional programs around Interior Infinite that you have planned.
Yeah, I mean, stay tuned. We are, I'm working with a couple colleagues, one of whom is based here and another is based in Johannesburg, South Africa, about shedding some light on the amazing contemporary photography that's happening in many places on the African continent right now, but Johannesburg and Addis Ababa, particularly where Zanele Moholi and Aida Mulune work. We're also going to be, I've heard murmurings from Skeena Reese and Dana Claxton. Dana's a longtime mentor of Skeena's, about doing an elaboration on their work. It could be a podcast, but we'll see. Maybe we can do something in person with Victim Princess Mother. I hope so. And excitingly, there's actually a drag ballroom house here in Vancouver, an all-Asian drag family led by their mother, Shay Dior, called the House of Rice. And one of the artists, Romy Kim, is someone who I was familiar with through, investigating this exhibition. They have an alter ego, Skim, who's a drag king. And we're working with the House of Rice on some fun activations that will be livening up the place throughout August. So stay tuned for that. So that's a little teaser. And I'll hold off on saying more, because we're still, we just opened up shortly after the show opened, so things are becoming possible now, and we're thinking through possibilities.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for one more question, and we have one from the audience from Jin Yu. And it's taking us back to the beginning, back to the title. So could you elaborate a little on the title, Interior Infinite, specifically the text that this refers to, or is it a look into ourselves? Or perhaps the interior of our constructed normalcy. So we'd love to hear you speak a bit more about the title.
Sure. So Interior Infinite came, of course, from a book called Rabelais and His World by Mikhail Bakhtin, who was a Russian philosopher and linguist. And he was looking specifically at, he wrote this book about the Renaissance French novelist François Rabelais, who had written a series of novels, of sort of satirical novels, called The Lives of Gargantua and Pantagruel, and who are two giants. I think it's a giant father and a son. And Bakhtin was interested in looking at the milieu that Rabelais was reflecting on and responding to, and so ended up kind of doing this deep dive into the carnivalesque, the satirical, the grotesque, all of these kinds of ideas. And there's this passage in which he writes, "The interior infinite could not have been found in a closed and finished world, with its distinct fixed boundaries dividing all phenomena and values." I think that's how it goes, although maybe a couple words are switched in there. And for me, the term interior infinite comes up twice in this passage, and it's always italicized for emphasis. And for me, it was interesting to read those words and interpret them. To my mind, the interior infinite conveys two things. One, that within each of us, the world is unfinished, things aren't decided, everything is mutable. And the interior infinite within each of us, I think, speaks to that potential limitlessness, that capacity for expansiveness, which is very carnivalesque in that way. And that we as a society, we've imagined many of the injustices and harms that plague us. A lot of them are arbitrary, and with social imagination, we could come together and reimagine them differently. So there's the interior infinite could not have been found in a closed and finished world, kind of speaks to me of that. And so it was kind of a provocative title in that way. So that's sort of where the title was drawn from. The interior infinite could not have been found in a closed and finished world. Actually, there was one point where we were considering that being the entire title of the show, that whole line. That would have been a lot. But that's kind of what it refers to. This sort of untapped capacity.